Okay, well, welcome everyone to the webinar. We're going to go and get started now. The presenter today is John Eason. He is a student of Stellan. Stellan, do you want to say a little bit about yourself as well?
Hello, everyone. I am an assistant professor at the University of Tulsa Chemical Engineering Department. I've been here for a little over 4 years now. My research group works on basically mostly design and optimization under uncertainty and how to propagate uncertainty through different models. So a little bit about uncertainty quantification and propagation. But we also work on process synthesis problems, and most process synthesis problems turn out to be very difficult optimization problems, and this led into our use of surrogate models. And John, senior this year at the University of Tulsa, has been with us for the last 3 years, and his work on this area has shown some very, very interesting results, and I think those are some of the things that we'd like to share today.
Okay. Thanks, John, for the introduction. I'll go ahead and turn over the presentation now to John. So go ahead, John, and just so you know, everyone, I've muted your microphones. You can unmute those at any time if you just go to the list of participants and then select unmute on your microphone. Okay, John, go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you all for tuning in. My name is John Eason, and I'm going to present on some sampling methods for efficient surrogate model generation. The objectives of our work is to develop a sequential sampling algorithm for surrogate model generation, specifically that generalizes well to any type of surrogate and is applicable in higher dimensional problems that we frequently encounter in chemical engineering. Surrogate modeling is a process by which we can represent unknown or expensive functions using a simpler function as a sort of regression to a set of data. So this allows several advantages. It allows us to use traditional optimization for complex black box functions if we're able to construct a good surrogate. And it also allows for ease of sensitivity analysis and just other exploration of the design space once you have a good surrogate. And here I have several examples of where it's been applied in chemical engineering in the past. So the traditional method of constructing a surrogate model involved selecting an experimental design, traditionally some random sampling, a factorial design, or a Latin Hypercube design, gathering samples from some complex function at these points from your experimental design, constructing the surrogate to fit to those points, validating the performance of your surrogate, and then if the performance isn't satisfactory, you begin again with a new experimental design, a larger sample size, or a more complex surrogate to model the behavior. However, if we have a situation where the underlying function we're trying to model is very expensive, it's very much in our interest to minimize the number of samples that it requires to fit the surrogate. So the best way to do that is through sequential design. This is a process where we start with a very small initial sample size that probably isn't going to be sufficient to capture the behavior, and then we just slowly increase the sample size until the performance of the surrogate actually manages to perform well enough. We can increment arithmetically, geometrically, just depending on the choice. Geometric's usually best because as you increase the sample, the relative impact of each sample point is lower. But if the underlying function is very expensive, arithmetic sampling becomes advantageous just to really minimize the number of function evaluations. And then at each iteration, we test the performance by withholding some samples as test data to see how the surrogate's performing. So just to run through that process again, we begin with an initial sample, construct a surrogate, and then we select some new sample points, evaluate the underlying function at the new samples, construct the surrogate again, and then eventually we test the improvement in our surrogate's performance, and if the performance has leveled out, then we can terminate. But the focus of this presentation is in this red box right here, and how we select some new sample points in the optimal way to minimize the total of number of times to go around here, and minimize the number of samples we generate overall. So there are two goals we're looking for when we're picking new sample points. There's the goal of exploration and the goal of exploitation. Goal of space fillingness or exploration. And we can see here, given this underlying function, the blue line, and we have a nice initial space filling design right here. Given this initial design, we know that there's this peak here, but it actually completely misses the behavior of the second peak right here. So if we were to refine that design with a space filling approach, an exploration approach, we fill in between our existing sample points. And what you see here is that we're able to capture the behavior of the second peak, but we're still not very sure what's going on with what's happening at this peak here. So as an alternative approach, yeah,
I just had a question for you about these surrogate models. Are these linear approximations then, or are you just saying that they can form at all?
No, this is going to be some type of nonlinear approximation. We use artificial neural networks in this work, but you could do Kriging or support vector machines, things like that. Yeah, so
these are all optimizing for the artificial neural network then.
Right.
Okay, great.
So, yeah, we're selecting points that we're going to train our neural nets to. So yeah, the second goal we're working with is the exploitation goal. So in this way of looking at it, when we saw that we had this one sample in an interesting region up here, it's desirable to gather more samples right in that area. And you can see with this approach, when we focus right on there, we're able to very accurately capture the behavior of the function in this part, but we don't ever notice that there's another interesting area of the function up here. So we're concluding that ideally we'd like to take both of these considerations into account when we're sampling, to both explore the design space and exploit areas of interest. So this slide goes over a review of sequential sampling approaches in the past. Space filling approaches have beginning with random as kind of a base case, and a creator factorial design as another sort of very widely used base case. But random sampling isn't very space filling. It's not very efficient use of exploring the design space. And factorial sampling doesn't sequentialize very well. If you want to refine the grid, then your step size is very large, especially as the dimensionality increases. The Latin Hypercube design, of course, is very easy to use in high dimensions, and the incremental Latin Hypercube algorithm, which our group developed in the past, is a way of incrementing sequentially while maintaining a Latin Hypercube design. There have been several sampling techniques proposed that revolve around Delaunay triangulations or Voronoi tessellations, which perform very well, but it's difficult to generate these Delaunay triangulations at high dimensionality. So as we get above 6 dimensions, these become prohibitively computationally expensive. Low discrepancy sequences have been proposed and used quite frequently, such as the Halton sequence, the Sobol sequence. But recent comparative works have shown that these don't hold up as well against some of these other methods. And finally, there's some optimization-based methods where you try to optimize either the maximum distance, as proposed by Johnson here, or try to maximize the projected distance of a new sample point relative to your existing sample. And again, these perform very well, but as we increase the dimensionality, it gets computationally expensive to try to work with these optimization surfaces. On the adaptive side, for some types of surrogate models, such as kriging, we can work with the model itself. The way it's constructed gives us an estimate of the variance of our prediction of the output from the surrogate. But when that's not available, we can estimate that variance using a process known as jackknifing, and then try to sample the overall theory being we'd like to sample at points that have a very high uncertainty in the surrogate output. Alternatively, there's local linear approximations. This is a method where they solve some multi-objective optimization problems to try to estimate the gradient from the existing sample points. But again, this one gets complicated when we increase the dimensionality and having to solve these problems over and over for every single point we want to add to the space, add to our sample. So after reviewing all these past approaches, we selected 3 algorithms that we think are very promising given our goals, and we ran some comparative work on these. First, we have the incremental Latin Hypercube. Again, that's a space-filling approach that maintains a Latin Hypercube design. The Jackknife adaptive approach. So we sampled the points with the highest uncertainty in our surrogate output. And a mixed adaptive approach, which is one we developed that considers both an adaptive and space-filling qualities when we're selecting the data. So Latin Hypercube sampling is a method where we take and divide each of our variables into equal probability bins, select one point randomly within each bin, and then randomly mix. So you can see these are all examples of Latin Hypercube designs, where in each row and each column you have one sample somewhere within those boxes. They're very useful for high dimensions. They might not be very space-filling, but you can eliminate them during generation if that's acceptable, or use a pre-built optimal Latin Hypercube design, which you can find in the literature. The incremental Latin Hypercube algorithm is a method of sequentializing this, where we redivide the variables into a new sample size, discard overlapping samples, and fill the empty bins. So beginning with the original Latin Hypercube design here, and we have a new sample size we'd like. So we redivide the variables. We check within each interval whether or not it's containing more than one sample point. If so, eliminate the sample points that are the most overlapping. Then check again. And if every interval contains one sample point, then we're good. If the interval does not have a sample point, then we randomly sample within the interval to get a new point, and then randomly combine again, and we're left with a new Latin Hypercube design at the end. The jackknifing approach is, again, a method of estimating the prediction variance from a set of models that we generate in the validation stage. So we begin by generating a set of surrogates using selected subsets of our data. So just leaving some data out each time, we fit the function over and over again. Then we take a set of proposed points and evaluate the output of the surrogate at these proposed points using each surrogate. And we can look at the variance of those predictions as a sort of an estimate of the variance of the overall surrogate's prediction. And then we sample at the points with the highest variance from our set of proposed points. So the set of proposed points is just we used a dense Latin Hypercube of like 1,000 points. Finally, we have the mixed adaptive algorithm. This is, we assign an overall quality parameter eta to a large set of proposed points in a similar manner to the pure adaptive approach. So eta here, It's a normalized combination of that estimated variance from the jackknifing approach, so the variance at the proposed point I over the maximum of all of the variance of the proposed points, and the maxi-min criteria here. So it's the nearest neighbor distance to the existing sample set relative to the largest one there. So it's normalized highest possible scores to, and then from our set of proposed points, we pick the ones with the highest value of eta to add to our sample. So our comparison studies between these three types of, these three algorithms, we used artificial neural networks as the surrogate model. The model validation technique was cross-validation. In cross-validation, we divide our sample into k subsets. We use k equals 10, and train the networks with each subset used as test data. So, for example, the first time, we'll leave out subset 1 and train the neural networks with sets 2 through 10, and then set 1 is test data, and we use that to gauge how well the neural network is fitting the data. And then we repeat with set 2 left out as test data, and so forth. We began with pre-optimized Latin Hypercube designs and increased the sample size geometrically with beta equals 0.3. We selected 3 challenge functions, the peaks function, the Ackley function, and the Shekel function. These are chosen kind of in order of increasing nonlinearity here. The peaks function is relatively very smooth. Ackley function's kind of in the middle, and the Shekel function is a very sharp nonlinearity that's very difficult to model. Because the Shekel function was so difficult, it provided us with the most interesting results that really differentiated the different sampling algorithms. So I'm going to walk through the results from that in more detail. So here we're going to walk through the incremental Latin Hypercube first, at the initial Latin Hypercube sampling over here on the left. And as you can see with this initial sampling, we don't capture the behavior of this sharp spike at the actual minima at 4.4. So as we increment our sampling algorithm, we're adding more samples, still not really capturing that behavior. And by the time the algorithm terminates after 10 iterations, we're still just barely capturing a small dip in the middle. What's happening here is because we have so many samples spread out around the design space in the relatively linear region, the weight of the points that are actually around the minimum right here is significantly less, and when we're fitting the data, fitting the surrogate to it, it treats those kind of more like it's noise. So this demonstrates the need for an adaptive approach to put more samples there to make sure that we fit there, that region. So next we have the purely adaptive approach, the jackknifing sampling, beginning with a pre-optimized Latin Hypercube. And we can see as soon as we iterate, it picks up on the uncertainty right in the area of interest and samples very heavily right there. And we get a nice dip in our response on the right here. Unfortunately, when we add some more samples, now the area that was uncertain was all over here, and the relative weights of the points in the middle here is decreased, and we lose the response of the networks that we trained. Luckily, as we keep iterating, we keep adding more points in the middle, and it becomes a little more balanced. And by the time we terminate, we have at least a better representation of the Shekel function than we had with the incremental Latin Hypercube. However, it's important to note that there are several regions here that we never actually sampled any further from our initial Latin Hypercube. So this region right here, kind of in here. So that shows a disadvantage of sampling purely adaptively because we never explored that space further to see if there's any other interesting behavior going on there. Finally, the mixed adaptive algorithm. This one takes a little longer to start out as we're exploring the design space, but the improvement in the function is a little smoother than we had with the purely adaptive approach until we hit this point right here. Because we're both exploring the space and adapting to sample right at the minimum, what happened here is, for whatever reason at this point in the process, the number of samples that we have that we were increasing throughout the design space out here outweighed the number of samples we have in the minimum here, and we lost that behavior. It's treated as noise. Luckily, with additional samples, and by the time we terminate, once again we have fairly good representation of the Shekel function. And this slide shows the comparison of the terminated functions. You can see the difference between the incremental Latin Hypercube and the adaptive approaches. And the mixed adaptive approach has a little bit sharper, a little bit deeper dip than the others. And we conclude it's the best way forward to both explore the design space and capture the behavior of the function as best we can. So this slide shows some of our considered termination criteria. And this actually proved to be something of a problem that we're still working on, is how to deal with how to tell when we've terminated and whether or not the surrogate is accurately matching the underlying function. Mean squared error is, of course, a very common one to use. But you can see, ideally, we'd like our termination criterion to nicely decrease and level off and stabilize. But it's a little noisy in the middle, but by the end they do stabilize. But what's interesting to note here is there's no distinction between the final mean squared error of the incremental Latin Hypercube and the final mean squared error of the adaptive approaches. When looking at the functions, we can clearly tell that the adaptive approaches much more accurately captured the behavior of the function than the space-filling approach. So we thought, as a way to maybe work around that, we could look at the max squared error. So this is whatever test data had the largest error, just looking at that one. Unfortunately, it's very noisy. It jumps up and down all over the place here. And that's pretty alarming when you're working with it. You're not sure whether or not you're getting close to terminating or what's actually going on. In this case, what is going on is whenever we have a very high point here, that means that at least in one neural network that was trained in the validation stage, due to however the cross-validation cuts were made, we cut out the data that was in the minimum, and that's going to result in a very high error right there for a test data point. When we removed it from training, but then we're testing at the minimum, there's a very high error. It does stabilize out in the end, but we think that the noise in the process of getting there makes it unacceptable as a termination criterion. And finally, for the adaptive approaches, we looked at the maximum of the prediction variance. So from the output of the jackknifing approach, we have an estimate of the prediction at each of the proposed points, which in theory should work well, because as the model fits better, we'd expect less uncertainty in the predictions when we have more and more samples. But this provides a problem because were we working with an actual black box system, we would have thought we terminated right here at the very beginning of our process. When what's actually happening there is we don't have enough points to accurately capture the behavior, so it's always fitting a very simple response. and that's why the prediction variance is very low. Whereas once we actually start capturing the nuances of the function, the variance increases, even though our fit has actually gotten better. So I'll just run very quickly through the behavior of the other functions. And if you have any more questions about this, just go ahead and feel free and jump in or ask me at the end. The Ackley function had smoother improvement than the Shekel function. Looking at the mean squared error, we decided that the mean squared error was probably best to go with for this time because it did have a general overall trend of improvement and leveling out once things have once the surrogates are fitting pretty well. The incremental Latin Hypercube and the mixed adaptive algorithms perform similarly, but the pure adaptive algorithm had a little trouble because the termination criteria leveled out right here in this region before we actually had an accurate fit. And but you can see once we actually reach about 9, I think there's 9 iterations here for each of these functions, the actual function compared to the fit functions, the surrogates are modeling the behavior very well and pretty much indistinguishable from the different sampling techniques. The peaks function, because it's the smoothest function of them all, we see the smoothest improvement in the surrogate performance, and they all performed essentially the same, and by the time they terminate, again, we have very good fits from all 3 techniques. So we took the mixed adaptive algorithm and applied it to a case study. We previously worked in this case study in our group with the development of the incremental Latin Hypercube algorithm. So now we're going to look at comparing those two and how they perform for fitting an actual black box surface. The problem is to minimize the CO2 capture cost with the decision variables of stripper inlet temperature, amine concentration, absorber stages, stripper stages, reboiler duty, and the circulation rate. We tested with 2 solvents, MEA and DEA. MEA was chosen because we knew from our previous work that this is a complicated surface. There's a region over in one of the corners of the design space that's generally very flat, but there's a few peaks in there that are kind of hard to locate. And DEA was chosen as an example of a surface that that we knew was very smooth and relatively easy to model. So we just look at these 2 cases, one hard, one more simple. MEA, here's the graph of the mean squared error as we iterate. And as we might anticipate from it being a little more complex surface, it's not the smoothest improvement, but we do see very clear leveling off and termination out here at 7 and 8 iterations, terminated at 7, actually. We ran 8 just to be sure that our measurement of it was working right and that it really had leveled off. You'll see in a second here. Because after 7 iterations with 360 sample points, we optimized on the neural nets using Barron version 9.0.6. And the solution that we got didn't match with the process simulator. So this is the result. The neural net said this should be our minimum cost, predicting this minimum cost. But we took the same solution back into the simulator, and it didn't match at all. This is in the region that we were worried about from, we knew this was the region over in the corner of the design space where it's flat, but it took us right to the point where there's actually a peak. So to get around that, we added 40 points down contraction. So 40 points right in the region around where we had solved to with this previous solution right here. And with those 40 points, then we were able to capture that behavior there. And the new sample, the new solution fits and it matches the process simulator within 1% or so. And that's comparative to the solution we had from our previous work with the incremental Latin Hypercube, which converged after 480 points. Second case with DEA as a solvent. As we would expect with a smoother surface we're fitting, the response of the mean squared error here is much smoother, and we terminate after 6 iterations, or 270 points. So when we optimize on that neural network, luckily this time we fit right away. The solution we converged to matches with the process simulator. Compared this to the solution we had with the incremental Latin Hypercube approach, which took 480 points to terminate. While that obtained a good solution as well, here we see that the mixed adaptive algorithm was able to reduce our number of samples significantly. That reduction becomes a little more significant when we actually look at the total number of samples that we had to generate in order to get that incremental Latin Hypercube design. In order to maintain the Latin Hypercube design, we have to cut some points at each iteration, which of course isn't very desirable if we're going to have to iterate a while, that we have to evaluate these sample points and then we're not using them at later iterations. So you can see the comparison here. By the time the mixed adaptive algorithm converged to 270 data points, 270 function evaluations had been made. But by the time that the incremental Latin Hypercube converged to 480 data points, we had almost made 900 function evaluations. So on this basis of comparison, the mixed adaptive algorithm provided a very significant improvement. As another conclusion, though, we need identification of a proper termination criterion is difficult and somewhat problem specific, and that's going to require a little more work. And in the future, we'd also like to look at adding different weights to the mixed adaptive algorithm to prevent what we saw as when the space fillingness dominated rather late in the design process. So ideally, we'd favor exploration early in the design process, surrogate design, and then adapt more later once we've found those regions of interest. And finally, we'd like to look at inclusion of optimization as an adaptive sampling method to look at when we had that bounds contraction, we could think of that as sort of an optimization being used as an adaptive sampling method. But perhaps we could include that earlier in the sampling process to prevent the need for just adding that on right at the end. So that's all I have, and thank you all for your attention. Let's go ahead and open it up for questions and discussion.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, John. I'll just remind everyone you can take your microphone off of mute if you'd like to ask a question. There's a red button on the side under the participants list on the toolbar at the top if you'd like to ask a question. So let me, really interesting work. Let me ask just one question just to get us started. So it looks like this can be used for any black box, from a simulator, for optimization. What have you thought about using this as well for experimental optimization as well, where you essentially are running a number of experimental points, and then and what kind of challenges do you think there would be if you're running experimental cases instead of simulation cases?
Oh, that's a very good question. You'd have to look at some of the other more traditional design and experiment methods, as far as the repetition and so forth that would you'd have to incorporate as you go along. I haven't looked at that specifically, but I think that could definitely be adapted. If you're going into an experiment planning to just fit an empirical model to it, this could definitely, I think this might play a role there in helping you evaluate points that you should sample.
Mm-hmm. and I guess in the case where the experiments are very expensive, you may adaptively collect data points as as your adaptive algorithms would indicate. But I thought it was very interesting how these things might be applicable to a wider range of problems than was really proposed in this work, and I think you guys have some great promise there for looking at other areas as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, any other questions? I'm just going to take everyone's microphone off of mute until we start getting too much feedback there. So we had one question from the chat earlier on as well. Anybody? We pull up that chat. So one question was, what is the symbol H? Now, this was near the beginning of your presentation. Jan had asked that question.
The symbol H. Oh, yes. The H here is just an iterator to know that we need to iterate our function and our sampling algorithm at least twice in order to see how we're improving. So when we're drawing those graphs of the mean squared error, the way we look at termination is the slope of our most recent iteration compared to the largest slope so far. So in order to have a previous slope to compare it to, we need to go through this sample selection point at least twice.
Okay, Jan, is that clear enough for you?
Yes. Thank you. I have another question. So in your case study and all the results you present mean squared error. Have you considered to present cross-validation error because it's a better measure of true error? And usually, mean squared error has a tendency to overfit the model.
What do you mean by the cross-validation error?
So, so you present your iteration result based on the mean squared error.
Yes.
But then, so in general, mean squared error has a tendency to overfit the model. So then usually you would have cross-validation error to better predict which iteration you would like.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by cross-validation error. How would that be defined?
Yeah, actually, I also got the same question. So how you define this is Jing Liang Ma from NETL. How you define this mean square error? Is that mean square error based on the artificial neural networks mean square error, or it's based on cross-validation error?
It is. Oh, I see what you mean. It's based on the cross-validation test error. Yeah, it's the mean squared error of the test data from each of the 10 cross-validated sets.
Okay, it's not.
Yeah, okay. I think that's important because neural network also gives you some thing called
there's some error for the training data itself. Yeah, it's not that.
And also you mentioned about the variance when you're using the adaptive sampling. How you exactly calculate those variance?
We're not exactly calculating it. It's an estimate that we generate with this jackknifing approach here. With some other types of surrogates, if you're using kriging, you can get a more exact estimate.
Yeah, I know kriging. You can method predict the variance.
Right. So we're getting.
But if you neural network, how you calculate that?
It's through this process right here, where we take our cross-validation sets and evaluate each cross-validated neural network, at a proposed point and then look at the variance of those predictions.
Okay, so it's based on sort of your cross-validation, you have multiple cross-validations, and you kind of average them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more question. If anybody has one more question, we'll have to take that.
Hi, this is Yan from Carnegie Mellon University again. So I have another question about your case study results. So I noticed there's a discrepancy between the optimal temperature you obtained with your pure adaptive samples and the optimal temperature in mixed adaptive sampling techniques. Like, have you considered to figure out like which one is actually the true optimal?
That's a good question. As you can see, there is some variance.
All the results are basically compared compared within the optimal result based on surrogate models. So have you ever considered to obtain the true optimal based on the true real simulation?
Are you talking about running an actual solver over the simulation itself?
Right. So you can
the thermodynamics algorithm. This is Selen Kramowski. The thermodynamics and the equation set is so nonlinear and so bad that I don't think any of the optimization algorithms, global optimizers, are going to actually get a solution on the equation-based process for this process.
That I understand, but I mean, there are other algorithms like the genetic algorithm you can still try.
Yeah. Yes. So they're derivative-free algorithms. I look at it, but again, none of them actually guarantee optimality. So we'll be looking at a very similar issue. But in order to clarify something about the regenerator feed temperature, we've also done, not John, but another student of mine has also done extensive sensitivity analysis for the cost. And what we have figured out is actually the change in the regenerator feed temperature has very, very little effect. So the difference you see here really does not change much in terms of the cost.
Okay.
So it's very insensitive to it. It's just one of the independent variables that we've originally considered, and actually I think that's something we can drop from that list.
Okay. And another question, like how long does it take to run one-time simulation? Like it seems like there are 400 samples.
About 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes.
For each simulation?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, John and Selen, for presenting today.